Every Imperial Vox-Operator learns the first rule of deep space communications on their inaugural day of service. Never acknowledge transmissions that don't exist in the official logs. Marcus Trell had followed that rule religiously for 8 years aboard the Imperial frigate Righteous Fury, filtering thousands of routine messages without incident until the day something impossible reached through blessed Gellar Fields and spoke his name in a voice that sounded like crystallized starlight. The transmission came from nowhere. No astropathic relay, no ship-to-ship frequency, no recognized Imperial channel. Yet it utilized their sacred communication equipment as if it had always belonged there. What emerged from the speakers was a language that shouldn't exist. Words that hurt to understand, yet somehow conveyed meaning directly into Marcus's consciousness without passing through his ears. It spoke of mathematics that could reshape reality, of colors that existed beyond mortal perception, of truths that would elevate him far above his humble station as keeper of the ship's Vox arrays. Marcus Trell was 32 years old, ancient by Imperial Guard standards, his weathered hands dancing across the communication console with the practiced precision of a master craftsman. The Vox station hummed around him in the depths of the vessel, banks of cogitators and transmission equipment casting sickly green light across features scarred by a lifetime of faithful service to the Emperor's navy. He took pride in his work. Every transmission filtered, every astropathic message decoded, every ship-to-ship communication monitored with the dedication that 8 years of exemplary service had ingrained in his very soul. The frigate had been making routine passage through the Cadian Gate sector when reality chose to notice him. Marcus was performing standard maintenance on the primary Vox array, running diagnostics that he had completed thousands of times before when the impossible occurred. The voice that emerged spoke in harmonics that made the ship's hull sing in frequencies beyond human hearing, offering knowledge that could unlock secrets hidden since the dark age of technology. He should have activated emergency protocols immediately, should have summoned the ship's confessor, alerted Security Chief Korvain, followed every procedure drilled into him during decades of faithful service. Instead, something about the transmission compelled him to listen as it whispered of distant stars where time moved backward, of equations that could fold space like origami, of a destiny that stretched far beyond his role as a mere keeper of communications equipment. The ship's Gellar Fields registered perfect functionality. The tech priests had certified them only hours earlier, yet somehow the warp had reached through their protection as if those blessed barriers were nothing more than tissue paper. When the transmission finally ended, Marcus sat in stunned silence while his instruments registered no record of incoming communication, no unusual energy signatures, no evidence that anything had occurred beyond the routine hum of Imperial technology going about its sacred duties. But Marcus knew better. Something fundamental had shifted in those moments of impossible contact. Something that made his reflection lag slightly behind his movements in the polished surfaces of his equipment. The air itself felt different, charged with potential that made his teeth ache and his vision blur at the edges when he tried to focus on shadows that seemed deeper than they had been moments before. He should have reported the incident, but who would believe a phantom transmission that left no trace in the ship's carefully monitored systems? The confessor would declare him mad, or worse, corrupted by contact with forces that existed beyond Imperial doctrine. Captain Hendrix would order him spaced rather than risk contamination spreading through his crew. So Marcus remained silent, convincing himself that stress and long hours had finally caught up with him, that nothing had really changed in those impossible moments. If you crave more tales from the dark millennium where a single moment of curiosity can damn entire worlds, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who support the channel, and you'll need his protection for the nightmare that's about to unfold. deep in the back of Marcus's mind, barely perceptible yet undeniably present, something new had taken root. A whisper that matched the crystalline voice from the transmission, offering fragments of forbidden knowledge that seemed to arrive fully formed in his thoughts. As he returned to his duties with mechanical precision, Marcus told himself that everything was normal, that his 8 years of faithful service would continue unmarked by supernatural intervention. He was catastrophically wrong, and in the days that followed, the crew of the Righteous Fury would discover that some transmissions carry more than information. They carry invitations to transformations that reshape both flesh and soul, according to the whims of entities that measure patience in geological epochs and hunger in the consumption of entire civilizations. The whispers began 3 days after the transmission, so softly at first that Marcus convinced himself they were merely echoes from the ship's ventilation systems. The Righteous Fury was an old vessel, her hull creaking with the accumulated stress of centuries spent traversing the hostile void, and strange sounds were nothing unusual aboard Imperial warships. But these whispers had a quality that distinguished them from mechanical noise. They seemed to respond to his presence, growing louder when he approached certain sections of corridor, falling silent when other crew members drew near. Marcus first noticed them during the night cycle, when he walked the dimly lit passages between his quarters and the Vox station. The ship's lumens cast long shadows that seemed to writhe and shift in his peripheral vision, and from those shadows came the softest murmur of voices speaking in that same beautiful language from the transmission. He would stop, straining to catch the words, but silence would greet him until he resumed walking. By the 4th day, the whispers had grown bold enough to follow him during his duty shifts. Marcus sat at his station, monitoring routine communications between the frigate and a nearby supply convoy, when he heard his name spoken in that impossible tongue. He spun around, searching the cramped confines of the Vox chamber, but found only the familiar banks of equipment humming their mechanical litanies. The other technicians, Servo Skull 47 Gamma and Tech Adept Varus, showed no sign of having heard anything unusual. The whispers weren't random anymore. They carried meaning that bypassed his conscious mind and embedded itself directly in his understanding. They spoke of the ship's route, suggesting minor course corrections that would take them through regions of space where the warp ran thin. They offered insights into the vessel's mechanical systems, pointing out inefficiencies in the Vox array that Marcus had never noticed despite years of maintenance. Most disturbing of all, they began revealing information about his fellow crew members, their private fears, hidden shames, and secret desires. Marcus discovered he could predict Quartermaster Chen's mood swings hours before they manifested. He knew when Navigator Voss would experience her chronic headaches, when the ship's cook would burn the evening rations, when Guardsman Kellic would wake screaming from nightmares about the Tyrannid invasion of his home world. The knowledge came unbidden, arriving in his thoughts like memories that weren't his own. The physical changes started subtly. Marcus noticed his reflection seemed slightly off in the polished surfaces of the Vox equipment, as if the image lagged a fraction of a second behind his movements. His shadow occasionally moved independently, gesturing when his hands were still, turning its head when he looked straight ahead. Sleep became elusive as the whispers grew more insistent during the quiet hours, speaking of wonders that existed beyond the narrow confines of Imperial doctrine. On the 7th day, Marcus made his first mistake. Tech Adept Varus was struggling with a particularly stubborn Vox relay, cursing in binary cant as sparks flew from the recalcitrant machinery. The whispers suddenly flooded Marcus's mind with technical specifications he had never learned, repair procedures that weren't in any Imperial manual, knowledge that seemed to come from the machine spirits themselves. "Try adjusting the resonance frequency to match the ship's hull harmonics," Marcus heard himself saying. The electromagnetic interference is creating a feedback loop in the tertiary circuits. Varys paused, his augmetic eye focusing on Marcus with mechanical precision. Where did you learn about electromagnetic resonance cascade theory? That's not standard Vox-Operator training. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine as he realized he had no idea where the knowledge had come from. The whispers had simply provided it, as if technical expertise could be downloaded directly into his consciousness. I read about it in a maintenance manual, he stammered, knowing how weak the lie sounded. But Varys had already implemented the suggested adjustment, and the Vox relay hummed to life with perfect clarity. The tech adept's expression was unreadable behind his augmetic implants, but Marcus caught a flicker of suspicion in his remaining organic eye. That night, alone in his quarters, Marcus stared at his reflection in the small mirror above his wash basin. His face looked haggard, dark circles under eyes that seemed to hold flecks of color that hadn't been there before. The whispers were constant now, a barely audible chorus that spoke of changes yet to come, of potential that lay dormant in his mortal flesh, of a destiny that stretched far beyond his humble role as a Vox operator. He pressed his palms against his ears, trying to block out the beautiful voices, but the sound seemed to come from inside his skull. "Emperor, protect me," he whispered, invoking the familiar litany he had recited since childhood. For a moment, blessed silence fell, but then the whispers returned with renewed intensity, and Marcus could swear he heard laughter mixed in with the alien words. Navigator Lydia Voss had guided ships through the warp for 2 decades, her third eye sealed behind layers of blessed parchment and sacred unguents, her mind trained to perceive the currents of the Imperium without losing itself to madness. She could sense the emotional resonance of every soul aboard the Righteous Fury, their hopes and fears creating small eddies in the warp that a trained navigator learned to read like a mariner reads the wind. But lately, something aboard her ship was creating disturbances unlike anything in her experience. The anomaly centered on Vox-Operator Marcus Trell, a man she had barely noticed during her years aboard the frigate. In the warp site, most crew members appeared as steady candle flames, small, contained sources of psychic energy that posed no threat to navigation. Trell had always registered as slightly brighter than average, the mark of someone with minor psychic sensitivity, but nothing that would warrant attention from the ship's sanctioned psychers. Now, when Voss performed her routine calculations in the navigation chamber, Trell's psychic signature blazed like a beacon in her third eye's perception. Worse, the energy surrounding him wasn't the clean amber glow of human consciousness, but something that shifted and writhed with colors that had no names. Tendrils of impossible hues stretched from his location throughout the ship, touching other crew members and leaving traces of that alien luminescence in their aura. "Throne preserve us," Voss whispered as she completed her latest readings. The navigation chamber's hololithic displays showed their current position relative to nearby star systems, but her warp sight revealed something far more troubling. The space around Marcus Trell was becoming thin, reality wearing gossamer fine wherever his influence spread. If this continued, the ship might suffer a catastrophic Gellar Field failure even while traveling in real space. Voss had seen warp corruption before, the twisted remains of ships that had lingered too long in the Imperium, their crews transformed into things that barely remembered their humanity. But this was different. Whatever was happening to Trell seemed controlled, purposeful, as if something with vast intelligence was gradually reshaping him according to its own design. She accessed the ship's personnel files, searching for any indication of psychic ability in Trell's background. His records showed nothing unusual. Born on Cadia, recruited into the Imperial Guard at 18, served with distinction in 3 campaigns before being selected for shipboard communications duty. No mention of psychic incidents, no notation of unusual spiritual activities, nothing that would explain why he was becoming a focal point for warp energy. The navigation chamber's cogitators chimed softly, indicating an incoming astropathic message from Fleet Command. Voss placed her hands on the receiver nodes, allowing the distant psyker's thoughts to flow through the ship's communication array. The message was routine, updated navigation data for their current patrol route. But as it passed through the vessel's systems, she felt it brush against Trell's expanding influence. The message warped, its meaning subtly altered as it encountered the alien energies surrounding the Vox-Operator. Instead of standard fleet coordinates, Voss found herself receiving fragments of forbidden knowledge, star charts showing regions of space that officially didn't exist, navigation routes that led to systems where time moved in spirals, coordinates for worlds where the laws of physics had been rewritten by entities of unimaginable power. Voss severed the connection immediately, her hands shaking as she realized what had occurred. Trell's corruption was so advanced that it could intercept and modify astropathic communications, turning routine fleet traffic into vectors for forbidden knowledge. If this continued, every message that passed through the ship's communication array would carry traces of that alien influence, potentially corrupting Imperial communications across entire sectors. She activated the chamber's internal Vox system, establishing a direct connection to Captain Hendrix's quarters. The aging officer's voice crackled through the speakers with characteristic gruffness. "What is it, Navigator? We're not scheduled for another warp translation for 6 days." "Captain, I need to speak with you immediately about a developing situation," Voss said, choosing her words carefully. Ship's communications were monitored, and she couldn't risk Trell overhearing if he was still monitoring the Vox systems. "There's a navigational anomaly that requires your attention." A pause, then, "How serious?" Voss glanced at her instruments, watching as the readings fluctuated wildly around Trell's location. In her warp sight, she could see new tendrils of alien energy extending through the ship's corridors, probing at the barriers between dimensions with patient malevolence. "Category Omega, sir. Potential threat to ship's integrity and crew safety." Another pause, longer this time. Captain Hendrix had served in the Imperial Navy for 40 years. He understood the implications of navigator terminology. Category Omega meant existential threat to the vessel and everyone aboard. "I'm on my way," he said simply. As Voss waited for the captain's arrival, she monitored the growing disturbance around Marcus Trell. The man himself seemed unaware of the changes occurring in his vicinity, going about his duties with mechanical precision. But in the warp, his psychic signature continued to brighten, and those impossible colors were beginning to bleed into the physical realm. Soon, others would notice what her trained senses had already detected. She offered a brief prayer to the Emperor for guidance, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether the righteous fury would complete its mission or become another cautionary tale whispered among navigator houses about the price of lingering too long in the dark between stars. Captain Mordecai Hendrix had commanded Imperial vessels for 4 decades, weathering everything from Orc-War incursions to Tyrannid splinter fleets. But nothing in his experience had prepared him for Navigator Voss's report. The woman's normally composed demeanor cracked as she described the warp disturbances centered on Marcus Trell, her voice trembling slightly as she outlined the potential consequences of leaving the situation unchecked. "Show me," Hendrix commanded, his weathered features grim in the navigation chamber's dim lighting. Voss hesitated, then began unwrapping the blessed parchments that sealed her third eye. "Captain, what you're about to see, it may disturb you. The warp sight reveals truths that mortal minds weren't meant to comprehend." The third eye opened with an audible sound, like tearing silk, and immediately the chamber filled with an otherworldly pressure. Hendrix felt his skin crawl, As Voss's enhanced perception swept over him, her expression growing increasingly troubled as she focused on something beyond normal sight. "There," she whispered, pointing toward the lower decks where the Vox stations were located. "Can you see it?" Hendrix followed her gaze, seeing only the chamber's familiar bulkheads and equipment. But as he strained his vision, he thought he caught glimpses of something else, threads of impossible color that seemed to exist just beyond the edge of perception, writhing through the ship's structure like parasitic veins. "Emperor's blood," he breathed. Even without psychic sight, the wrongness was palpable. The air itself felt contaminated, heavy with a presence that made his teeth ache and his vision blur. "It's spreading, Captain," Voss continued, her third eye tracking the alien energies as they pulsed through the ship's corridors. "Every hour, the contamination extends further. Soon it will reach critical systems. The Gellar Field generators, the warp engines, the life support systems. If this corruption touches our protective barriers." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Hendrix knew what happened to ships when their Gellar Fields failed. He had seen the aftermath once during the Cadian campaigns, a transport vessel found drifting in real space, its hull intact but its crew transformed into things that had once been human. The Inquisition had ordered the ship destroyed with cyclonic torpedoes rather than risk anyone boarding it. "What do you recommend, Navigator?" "Immediate isolation of the affected individual, full containment protocols, blessed barriers, constant monitoring by sanctioned psychers, and—" She hesitated, her third eye focusing on something that made her face pale. "Captain, we need to contact the nearest Inquisition facility. This level of warp corruption doesn't occur naturally. Something with tremendous power is actively influencing your crew member." Hendrix activated his personal Vox unit, switching to a secure channel that bypassed the main communication array. He couldn't risk Trell monitoring their conversations if the man's abilities extended to intercepting command frequencies. "Security Chief Korvain, report to my ready room immediately. Authorization, Crimson 7. The response came quickly. "On my way, Captain." Within minutes, Security Chief Korvain arrived with 2 armed guards, their carapace armor gleaming under the chamber's lumens. The ex-Arbite's enforcer's scarred face showed no emotion as Hendrix explained the situation, but his hand drifted instinctively toward his bolt pistol when the captain described the warp contamination. "Standard containment won't be sufficient," Korvain said after hearing the full report. "If this Trell has become a focal point for warp entities, we'll need specialized equipment. Null field generators, psychically shielded cells, possibly even an Inquisition-grade holding facility." "We don't have that kind of equipment aboard a frigate," Hendrix replied grimly. "Then we make do with what we have. Reinforced brig cell, blessed barriers, constant guard rotation to prevent any single individual from prolonged exposure." "But Captain," Korvain's expression grew even more serious. "If the contamination spreads beyond containment, we may need to consider more permanent solutions." The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. If Marcus Trell became a direct threat to the ship, execution might be the only option to prevent catastrophic loss of life. "Initiate isolation protocols immediately," Hendrix ordered. "Use containment procedure Delta 7, full psychic suppression measures, no direct contact without my authorization." "And Korvain? Do this quietly. The crew doesn't need to panic about warp corruption spreading through the ship." As the security team departed to implement the captain's orders, Hendrix remained in the navigation chamber with Voss. Through her third eye, they watched the alien energies pulsing around Marcus Trell's location, now bright enough that even non-psychic crew members might begin noticing strange phenomena. "How long do we have?" Hendrix asked. Voss studied the readings, her enhanced perception tracking the contaminations spread through the ship's structure. "Hours, maybe days. But Captain, There's something else. The pattern of corruption. It's too organized, too purposeful. Whatever is influencing Trell isn't acting randomly. It has a plan, and every hour we delay gives it more time to implement that plan. In the depths of the ship, Marcus Trell continued his duties, unaware that his fate had just been decided by forces beyond his understanding. But in the warp currents surrounding the righteous fury, something ancient and patient smiled with satisfaction as its carefully laid plans moved toward their inevitable conclusion. The arrest came during the third watch, when the corridors of the righteous fury were dimly lit, and most of the crew slept in their cramped quarters. Marcus had just finished calibrating the Vox array for the night shift when Security Chief Korvain appeared in the doorway of the communication chamber, flanked by 4 armsmen in full combat gear. Their laser guns weren't drawn, but their hands rested meaningfully on the weapon's stocks. "Marcus Trell," Korvain announced, his voice carrying the authority of Imperial law. "By order of Captain Hendrix, you are to be confined pending investigation of suspected warp contamination. You will comply immediately and without resistance." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. The whispers, which had been a constant presence for days, suddenly intensified to a roar of alien voices offering advice, encouragement, and promises of power if he would only embrace what they offered. For a moment, he could see through their perception. The security team appeared as flickering shadows while he blazed with coruscating energies that made the ship's structure seem fragile as spun glass. I don't understand," he stammered, though part of him had been expecting this moment since the phantom transmission first reached him. "What contamination? I've done nothing wrong." Korvain's scarred features showed no emotion. "Step away from the equipment, Trell. Keep your hands visible at all times. Any sudden movements will be interpreted as hostile action." As Marcus moved away from the Vox console, the nearest armsman visibly flinched. Where the operator's shadow fell across the deck plating, the metal seemed to ripple like liquid, displaying patterns of impossible geometry that hurt to look at directly. The effect lasted only seconds, but it was enough to confirm what Navigator Voss had reported. "Emperor's blood," one of the guards whispered, raising his lasgun instinctively. "Steady," Korvain commanded, though his own hand had moved to his bolt pistol's grip. "Trell, you're going to walk ahead of us to the detention level. No sudden movements, no attempts to activate any equipment. Understood?" Marcus nodded numbly, his mind reeling from the implications. If they suspected warp corruption, his life was effectively over. The Imperium showed no mercy to those touched by chaos, regardless of intent or circumstance. He would be interrogated, probably tortured, and eventually executed, if he was fortunate enough to die before something worse decided his fate. The journey through the ship's corridors became a nightmare procession. With each step, reality seemed to bend slightly around Marcus, causing bulkheads to shift color, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources, making the deck plating ring with harmonics that shouldn't exist. The security team maintained their distance, weapons now openly drawn, as phenomena manifested in Marcus's wake. Emergency lighting flickered as they passed, displaying spectrums of illumination that human eyes weren't designed to perceive. Servo skulls monitoring the corridors malfunctioned, their machine spirits gibbering in binary cant as alien frequencies overwhelmed their senses. Most disturbing of all, crew members sleeping in nearby quarters began crying out in their dreams, experiencing visions of crystalline cities and impossible architectures as the warp disturbance washed over them. "Faster," Korvain urged, clearly recognizing that prolonged exposure was affecting his men. The armsman behind Marcus was muttering prayers under his breath, while another had begun twitching as if invisible insects crawled across his skin. The detention level had been hastily prepared with whatever psychic suppression equipment the frigate could muster. Blessed parchments covered every surface, inscribed with protective wards and passages from the Imperial Creed. Tech Adept Varus had rigged null field generators around the primary holding cell, their oscillating energies designed to disrupt psychic phenomena. The ship's Confessor, Matthias, waited beside the cell door with a censer burning sacred incense, his power armor bearing freshly applied purity seals. "Place him in Cell 7, Korvain ordered. "Full isolation protocol. No direct contact without command authorization." As Marcus crossed the threshold into the holding cell, the null field generators activated with a sound like tearing fabric. The psychic suppression hit him like a physical blow, driving the whispers back to a barely audible murmur, and making his enhanced perceptions fade to normal human levels. For the first time in days, his shadow fell naturally, and his reflection moved in perfect synchronization with his body. "The barriers are holding," Confessor Matthias announced, consulting an auspex modified to detect warp phenomena. "But I'm still reading residual contamination. Whatever has touched this man runs deeper than surface corruption." Through the cell's armored viewport, Marcus could see the security team's relief as the psychic pressure lessened. But he could also see the fear in their eyes, the knowledge that they were dealing with forces beyond their understanding or control. In the ship's corridors, emergency klaxons began sounding as other systems registered the after effects of his passage through the vessel. "What happens now?" Marcus asked, though he dreaded the answer. Korvain's expression was grim. "Now we wait for the captain to decide your fate, and we pray to the Emperor that whatever has marked you doesn't decide to reclaim its property." In the darkness of the holding cell, surrounded by blessed barriers and null field generators, Marcus Trell sat alone with the diminished whispers of entities that had traveled impossible distances to find him. The containment had bought the ship time, but both he and his captors knew it was only a temporary reprieve. In the warp, patient intelligences were already adapting their approach, preparing to test the limits of Imperial technology and human faith. Confessor Matthias had performed countless purification rituals during his decades of service to the Imperial Creed, from cleansing battlefield shrines defiled by heretic blood to sanctifying ships emerging from the warp's corrupting embrace. But nothing in his experience compared to the spiritual malignancy that clung to Marcus Trell like a second shadow. Even through the null field barriers, the man radiated wrongness that made Matthias's psychic wards burn against his flesh and caused his Rosarius to emit a low, continuous whine of spiritual distress. The Confessor had donned his ceremonial power armor for the ritual, its blessed ceramite plates inscribed with prayers and purity seals accumulated over 40 years of faithful service. His Crozius Arcanum hummed with contained power, its disruption field calibrated to banish the most stubborn demonic influences. The detention cell had been transformed into a makeshift shrine, every surface covered with sacred texts and holy symbols designed to create a sanctified space where the Emperor's light could burn away chaos corruption. "Begin the litany of purification," Matthias commanded, his Vox grill amplifying his voice with electronic authority. From the corridor outside, a choir of naval armsmen responded with the ritual words, their voices joining in harmony that should have driven back any warp-spawned influence. Marcus knelt in the center of the cell, his wrists bound with blessed chains that left angry red marks on his skin. The null field generators created a constant pressure that made breathing difficult and thinking clearly nearly impossible. But still he could feel the whispers at the edge of his consciousness, patient and amused by the human's attempts at spiritual cleansing. "Emperor of mankind," Matthias intoned, raising his Crozius toward the cell's ceiling. "Your servant calls upon your divine protection. Cast out the darkness that has taken root in this soul, burn away the corruption with your holy light." The disruption field flared brighter, its energies washing over Marcus in waves of purifying force. Where it touched him, his skin began to smoke and blister, but beneath the surface, something else writhed and twisted, resisting the consecrated energies with alien strength. The blessed chains grew hot enough to sear flesh, yet whatever inhabited Marcus showed no sign of weakening. "Confess your sins," the confessor commanded. "Speak the words that opened your soul to corruption, that we might seal the breach through repentance and faith." Marcus tried to comply, his voice cracking as he recounted the phantom transmission that had started his transformation. But as he spoke, his words began changing, shifting from High Gothic to languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. The alien syllables seemed to have physical weight, causing the cell's blessed barriers to flicker and spark as reality bent around their impossible meanings. "Silence!" Matthias roared, his Crozius blazing with disruptive energy. "You will not speak the words of damnation in this sacred space!" But the damage was done. Where Marcus's corrupted words had touched the air, small tears appeared in the fabric of reality, wounds through which things that should not exist began to peer with interest that burned like acid. The null field generators screamed as their machine spirits encountered forces they were never designed to contain, their power cells overloading in cascades of sparks and smoke. Through the cell's viewport, Matthias could see Security Chief Korvain gesturing frantically at his men, ordering them back as psychic phenomena began manifesting throughout the detention level. Bulkheads warped, displaying geometric patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. The deck plating cracked, revealing glimpses of crystalline structures that belonged to some impossible architecture existing parallel to their own reality. "The barriers are failing," Tech Adept Varus reported from his monitoring station, his augmetic implants sparking as they processed data streams that violated several laws of physics. "Whatever entity has marked this individual is actively countering our containment measures." Matthias felt sweat beading beneath his power armor as he realized the magnitude of their predicament. This wasn't simple warp corruption that could be burned away with faith and blessed weapons. Something with vast intelligence and unlimited patience had chosen Marcus Trell for reasons beyond human understanding, and it was not about to be denied its prize by Imperial ritual and technology. "Begin emergency protocols," he commanded, knowing they had only minutes before complete containment failure. "Prepare for potential demon manifestation. All crew members not essential to ship operations are to report to emergency stations immediately." In the holding cell, Marcus writhed against his blessed restraints as competing forces battled for control of his soul. The Confessor's purification ritual had awakened something that had been lying dormant, and now it pressed against the barriers of his mortal flesh with increasing urgency. His eyes blazed with colors that had no names, while his shadow twisted into shapes that belonged to no earthly geometry. "Fight it," Matthias urged, his voice carrying genuine compassion despite the horror of the situation. "Your soul belongs to the Emperor. Do not let these alien entities claim what is rightfully his." For a moment, Marcus seemed to hear him. The corrupted energies flickered, and his voice returned to something recognizably human. "Help me," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I never wanted this. I just listened to a transmission. That's all I did." But even as he spoke, the whispers were returning, stronger than ever, promising power beyond imagination if he would only stop fighting what was inevitable. In the warp, ancient intelligences smiled with satisfaction as their carefully laid plans moved toward fruition, knowing that Imperial faith and technology were ultimately inadequate defenses against patience measured in millennia. The phenomena spreading from Marcus Trell's containment had begun affecting crew members 3 decks away from the detention level. manifesting first as disturbed sleep patterns and progressing rapidly to something far more sinister. Chief Medical Officer Valeria Nash found herself treating an increasing number of patients reporting identical symptoms. Vivid nightmares featuring impossible cities of crystal and flame, waking visions of geometric patterns that seemed to move independently, and a persistent sense of being watched by entities that existed just beyond perception. "Another one," Medici Orderly Jenkins reported, leading a shaking ratings crewman into the ship's medical bay. "Found him in the engine room, staring at the plasma conduits and muttering in a language nobody recognizes." Nash examined the man's eyes with her medical auspex, noting the dilated pupils and the subtle discoloration that she was beginning to associate with warp exposure. The readings were troubling: elevated stress hormones, irregular brain activity patterns, and trace levels of psychic resonance that shouldn't exist in non-psycho personnel. "How many does this make?" she asked, already knowing the answer would be worse than yesterday's count. 17 in the last 6 hours, Jenkins replied grimly. "And the symptoms are getting more severe. The first cases were just nightmares and anxiety, but now they're experiencing shared hallucinations, speaking fragments of the same unknown language," and he hesitated, clearly disturbed by what he had witnessed. "And what, Jenkins?" "They're starting to change, ma'am. Physically. Seaman Torres grew a third finger overnight, fully functional, complete with bone structure and nerve connections. Engineering specialist Vex's shadow moves independently now, and when I scanned him with the medical auspex, it registered 2 distinct life signs from the same body." Nash felt her blood run cold. Physical mutations were among the most serious signs of chaos corruption, indicating that whatever force was influencing the crew had moved beyond simple psychological manipulation into actual biological transformation. If the contamination continued spreading at this rate, the entire ship would be compromised within days. "Implement quarantine protocols immediately," she ordered. "Separate the affected personnel from the general crew, establish medical isolation chambers and—" Her words were cut off by a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A resonant chime that made the medical bay's equipment flicker and caused every piece of metal in the room to vibrate in harmony. Through the reinforced viewport that looked toward the detention level, Nash could see reality rippling like water disturbed by an enormous stone. "What in the Emperor's name was that?" Jenkins whispered. Before Nash could respond, the ship's Vox system crackled to life with Captain Hendrix's voice, strain evident despite his attempt to maintain command authority. "All hands, this is the captain speaking. We are experiencing a Class 7 psychic emergency. All non-essential personnel are to report to designated safe zones immediately. This is not a drill." The designation sent ice through Nash's veins. Class 7 emergencies were theoretical scenarios discussed in Inquisition training manuals, situations involving major demon manifestation or reality-altering warp phenomena. She had never expected to encounter one aboard an Imperial frigate protected by functional Gellar Fields and blessed hull plating. The affected crew members in the medical bay began reacting to the psychic pulse that had swept through the ship. Their symptoms intensified dramatically. The man with the extra finger began speaking in fluent tongues that hurt to hear, while Specialist Vex's independent shadow started gesturing at empty air as if responding to invisible entities. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be communicating with each other through means that bypassed normal speech, their eyes reflecting the same impossible colors that had appeared in Marcus Trell's gaze. "Medici Nash to the bridge," came Navigator Voss's voice over the intercom. "Emergency consultation required immediately." Nash sealed the medical bay's blast doors, leaving Jenkins with strict instructions to maintain quarantine protocols at all costs, then made her way through corridors that seemed subtly wrong. The ship's geometry hadn't changed, yet somehow the familiar passages felt alien, as if she were walking through a perfect replica built by beings who understood the physical structure but missed some essential quality that made it truly human. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows that moved independently of their sources, while the deck plating rang with harmonics that suggested vast spaces existing parallel to the ship's hull. Other crew members she passed looked haunted, their eyes darting toward corners where nothing should exist, their hands unconsciously tracing protective wards in the air. When Nash reached the bridge, she found organized chaos. Captain Hendrix stood before the main tactical display, his weathered features grim as he studied reports from throughout the ship. Navigator Voss worked frantically at her station, her third eye unsealed and blazing with psychic energy as she tracked the warp disturbances spreading through their vessel. "Report, Chief Medical Officer," Hendrix commanded without turning from his displays. 17 confirmed cases of psychic contamination, with symptoms escalating rapidly beyond anything in my training, Nash replied. Physical mutations, shared hallucinations, apparent telepathic communication between affected individuals. Captain, if this continues, we'll lose the entire crew within 48 hours. Voss looked up from her instruments, her third eye focusing on something beyond normal perception. It's not random infection, Captain. The entity influencing Trell is actively selecting specific crew members, those with latent psychic sensitivity, those with existing spiritual doubts, those whose faith has been weakened by trauma or loss. It's building a network of corrupted souls throughout the ship. The implications hit Nash like a physical blow. If an intelligence of vast power was deliberately corrupting their crew, then Marcus Trell wasn't just a victim. He was the focal point of an invasion that threatened everything they held sacred. The warp translation alarm's piercing shriek filled the bridge as Navigator Voss's hands flew across her control console, initiating an emergency drop from warp space that would strain the ship's ancient systems to their breaking point. The righteous fury shuddered violently as it tore through the barrier between dimensions, its Gellar Field generators screaming protests that could be heard throughout the vessel's hull. "Translation complete," Voss announced, her third eye blazing as she fought to maintain control during the traumatic exit. "We are in real space, but barely. The field integrity is down to 37% and falling." Captain Hendrix gripped his command throne as the ship bucked like a wounded animal, emergency klaxons wailing from every deck. Through the main viewport, the twisted colors of warp space faded to reveal the cold stars of normal reality. But even here, the corruption followed them. Space itself seemed subtly wrong around the frigate, with starlight bending in impossible directions and distant nebulae displaying spectrums that violated known physics. "Why the emergency translation?" Hendrix demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The entity using Trell as an anchor was beginning to manifest physically in warp space, Voss replied, her voice strained from the psychic effort required to navigate while under supernatural assault. "I detected massive displacement signatures. Something the size of a small moon was approaching our position from impossible vectors. If we had remained in the warp another few minutes." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Whatever was stalking Marcus Trell had grown tired of subtle corruption and was preparing for direct intervention. The emergency translation had bought them time, but at the cost of damaging their only means of faster-than-light travel. Tech Adept Varus's voice crackled over the bridge communications from the engine decks. "Captain, we have multiple system failures throughout the ship. The emergency translation has caused cascade failures in 17 primary systems, and the warp drive will require extensive repairs before another jump is possible." "How long for repairs?" Hendrix asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Minimum 6 days, assuming we can source replacement components from our limited stores." More likely 8 to 10 days if the damage is as extensive as initial readings suggest. 8 days stranded in real space while an entity of unimaginable power hunted them through dimensions. Hendrix had faced impossible odds before, but never anything that could reach across the barriers between realities to claim its prey. "Security report," he commanded, switching to Korvain's frequency. The Security Chief's response came immediately. 23 crew members now showing signs of corruption, with the rate of new cases accelerating. The affected personnel are beginning to demonstrate coordinated behavior. They're not acting individually anymore, but as parts of some larger intelligence. On the tactical display, red indicators marked the locations of corrupted crew members throughout the ship. What had started as isolated cases was now forming distinct patterns, with the affected individuals positioning themselves at strategic locations, near critical systems, along major corridors, at choke points that would allow them to control movement through the vessel. "They're taking positions to maximize their influence over ship operations," Tactical Officer Bremen observed, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "If this continues, they'll have effective control over life support, navigation, and weapons systems within hours." Navigator Voss suddenly stiffened at her station, her third eye widening as it perceived something that made her face drain of color. "Captain, we have a more immediate problem. The corruption isn't confined to our ship anymore, it's spreading to local space." She activated the main display, showing their current position relative to nearby stellar phenomena. What they saw defied understanding. The space around the Righteous Fury was developing geometric patterns that existed in more than 3 dimensions, while distant stars flickered with colors that belonged to no natural spectrum. "The entity is using our presence as a beachhead," Voss continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every minute we remain here, more of real space becomes infected with warp phenomena. If this continues, we'll create a permanent breach between dimensions." The implications were staggering. They weren't just dealing with corruption aboard their own vessel. They were potentially creating a pathway that could allow warp entities direct access to real space, bypassing the natural barriers that protected reality from the Imperium's malevolent influence. "Options?" Hendrix demanded, turning to his senior staff. Chief Medical Officer Nash spoke first. "We could attempt to sever Trell's connection to the entity through extreme measures. Surgical removal of affected brain tissue, chemical suppression of all neural activity, even termination of the host." "The corruption has spread too far," Voss interjected. "Killing Trell might stop new infections, but the entity has already established footholds in 23 other crew members. It's no longer dependent on a single host." Engineering specialist Varys's voice crackled over the communication system. "We could attempt to overload our Gellar Field generators, creating a psychic pulse that might disrupt the entity's influence. But the process would likely destroy the generators and leave us completely vulnerable to warp predation." Hendrix studied the tactical display, watching as more red indicators appeared among his crew positions. Every option carried catastrophic risks, and time was running out. In the detention level below, Marcus Trell remained the epicenter of an infection that threatened not just their ship, but the fundamental stability of local space. "Prepare contingency plans for all options," he ordered grimly, "and pray to the Emperor that we choose correctly, because failure means more than just our deaths. It means opening a gateway for horrors that could threaten entire star systems." The containment cell had become a nexus of impossible architecture, its blessed barriers warping under forces that existed beyond the normal 3 dimensions of real space. Marcus Trell knelt in the center of the geometric impossibility, his form flickering between human flesh and something that belonged to crystalline cities and non-Euclidean angles. The null field generators had failed hours ago, their machine spirits driven insane by contact with mathematical concepts that violated the fundamental laws of reality. Around Marcus, the cell walls displayed surfaces that curved inward while simultaneously extending outward, creating spaces larger than the frigate itself within a chamber barely 3 meters square. Through these impossible vistas, shapes moved with purpose and intelligence, entities of pure thought, given form through will alone. Their attention focused on the mortal soul that had become their gateway into real space. Security Chief Korvain watched from the corridor outside, his scarred features grim as he studied readings from equipment that was rapidly becoming useless. The containment breach wasn't just physical anymore. It existed in dimensions that human instruments couldn't measure, spreading through conceptual space as well as physical reality. The blessed barriers are holding at 40% integrity, Confessor Matthias reported, though his voice carried little confidence. But whatever force is reshaping the cell operates according to principles that make our consecrations inadequate. Through the warped viewport, they could see Marcus's mouth moving, forming words in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues. Each syllable caused reality to ripple, creating small tears in the fabric of existence through which alien light poured like liquid fire. The air in the corridor grew thick with psychic pressure, making breathing difficult and thought processes sluggish. "How many crew members are fully compromised now?" Korvain asked, though he could see the answer in the tactical displays his men were monitoring. 37 confirmed cases, Sergeant Vex replied, his augmetic eyes sparking as it processed data streams that increasingly violated known physics. "But the corruption is evolving, sir. The affected personnel aren't just changing individually, they're becoming components of something larger." As if to demonstrate his point, the ship's Vox system activated throughout multiple decks, carrying voices that spoke in perfect unison. The corrupted crew members were reciting passages that sounded almost like Imperial litanies, but with subtle alterations that transformed prayers of protection into invocations of transformation. "Emperor who sits upon the crystal throne," came the unified chant. "We offer our flesh as vessels for your endless wisdom. Guide us through the angles of perception to truths beyond mortal understanding." Matthias felt his faith waver as he heard familiar prayers perverted into something that made his soul recoil. The corruption wasn't simply replacing Imperial doctrine, it was twisting it, using the familiar structures of belief to carry concepts that belong to entities far older than humanity's rise to the stars. "Sir," came a report from the bridge through Korvain's personal Vox unit. "The affected crew members are moving toward critical systems throughout the ship. They're not responding to direct orders or attempts at communication." On the security monitors, they could see the corrupted personnel walking through the ship's corridors with mechanical precision. Their movements were coordinated beyond what human minds should be capable of, suggesting that whatever intelligence guided them possessed awareness of the frigate's entire structure simultaneously. In the warped containment cell, Marcus suddenly looked directly at the viewport, his eyes blazing with colors that had no names in any human language. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the bulkheads ring like struck bells. "Why do you resist what offers only improvement?" he asked, though the words seemed to come from multiple throats, speaking in perfect synchronization. "Your Emperor promised transcendence through suffering, but we offer transcendence through understanding. Why do you choose pain when knowledge awaits?" Confessor Matthias stepped forward, his Crozius Arcanum blazing with disruptive energy. "Because our Emperor teaches that some knowledge comes at prices too terrible to pay," he replied, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades spent in service to the Imperial creed. "Your gifts are poison disguised as enlightenment." Marcus tilted his head, studying the confessor with interest that felt like physical pressure against the armored viewport. "Your faith is admirable, but limited. You see only what your doctrine allows. But we could show you truths that exist beyond the narrow confines of Imperial understanding. The cell's geometry shifted again, and suddenly the viewport was no longer looking into a 3-meter chamber, but across vast distances towards structures that belonged to a realm where thought became architecture and will reshape reality. Crystalline spires reached toward skies that burned with mathematical perfection, while beings of pure intellect moved through spaces that existed in more dimensions than human minds could comprehend. Behold the realm where all questions find answers, Marcus continued, his form becoming increasingly translucent as he spoke, where the barriers between knowledge and understanding dissolve, where the limitations of flesh yield to the infinity of thought. Korvain's hand moved to his bolt pistol, recognizing that they were moments away from complete containment failure. Whatever entity was speaking through Marcus had grown tired of subtle corruption and was preparing for direct manifestation. The time for half measures had passed. All stations, prepare for Code Terminus protocols, he announced through his Vox unit, using the designation reserved for situations requiring immediate lethal force to prevent catastrophic loss of life. But even as he spoke, alarms began sounding throughout the ship as the corrupted crew members reached their target destinations and began implementing changes to critical systems that would transform the Righteous Fury into something far different from an Imperial warship. The first sign that something far worse than corruption had found them came through the ship's Auspex arrays, a contact approaching from impossible vectors that suggested movement through dimensions beyond normal space-time. Navigator Voss watched her instruments with growing horror as the entity materialized not from any direction that could be plotted on 3-dimensional charts, but from angles that existed perpendicular to reality itself. "Captain," she reported, her voice tight with barely controlled terror. "We have a massive psychic signature manifesting at bearing. Emperor preserve us, it doesn't have a bearing. It's approaching from directions that don't exist." On the bridge's main tactical display, the contact appeared as a writhing mass of geometries that hurt to look at directly. The ship's machine spirits struggled to process sensor data that violated fundamental principles of physics, their cogitators sparking and smoking as they attempted to render the impossible into comprehensible forms. "What are we looking at?" Captain Hendrix demanded, though part of him suspected no human language contained adequate words for what hunted them through the void. "A Greater Daemon of Tzeentch," Navigator Voss whispered, her third eye blazing as she forced herself to perceive the entity directly, despite the psychic agony it caused. "But not just any demon. This is one of the Architect of Fate's most favored servants, a being of such power that it can manifest partially in real space without requiring a full demonic incursion." The entity's presence pressed against the ship's hull like a physical weight, causing the blessed armor plating to crack and warp as alien geometries intersected with human engineering. Through the viewport, the crew could see reality bending around their vessel as space itself struggled to accommodate something that existed in 9 dimensions while they remained trapped in 3. Tech Adept Varus's voice crackled over the communication system from the engine decks, strain evident even through his mechanical Vox grill. "Captain, we're detecting massive structural stress throughout the ship's framework. Whatever is out there, its mere presence is causing our hull to experience forces that shouldn't be possible in normal space." The demon's influence reached through the ship's corridors like invisible tendrils, touching the minds of every crew member aboard. Those already corrupted by Marcus Trell's transformation began changing more rapidly, their flesh flowing like wax as the entity reshaped them according to its own incomprehensible design. But even the unaffected personnel felt the psychic pressure, their thoughts becoming sluggish as alien concepts pressed against the barriers of their consciousness. In the detention level, Marcus Trell's containment cell had become a wound in reality, through which the demon could extend its influence. The blessed barriers flickered and failed as energies that existed beyond the Emperor's protection poured through the breach, transforming the narrow chamber into a gateway that connected the frigate directly to the crystal labyrinth of Tzeentch. It's here for him, Confessor Matthias realized, watching as Marcus's form became increasingly translucent. Trell isn't just corrupted, he's been chosen as an avatar, a living anchor point that allows this entity to manifest in our reality. Through the ship's internal sensors, they could see the corrupted crew members abandoning their positions at critical systems and moving toward the detention level with mechanical precision. Their transformation had accelerated dramatically, flesh becoming something that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that human perception couldn't process. "All hands, battle stations," Captain Hendrix announced through the ship's Vox system, knowing that conventional weapons would be useless against their supernatural opponent, but needing to maintain some semblance of command authority. "This is Captain Hendrix. We are under attack by forces of the Archenemy. The Emperor protects the faithful." But even as he spoke the familiar words of Imperial doctrine, Hendrix could feel doubt creeping into his mind. How could faith and Lasfire stand against an entity that could reshape reality with thought alone? What protection could the Emperor offer against beings that had existed since before humanity first looked up at the stars? The demon's voice reached them then, not through any communication system, but directly into their thoughts, speaking in harmonics that bypassed the ears and resonated in the soul itself. Its words carried the weight of cosmic truth, offering knowledge that could resolve every mystery, answer every question, solve every problem that plagued mortal existence. "Children of the false Emperor," it spoke, each word causing reality to ripple around the ship. "You struggle against inevitability, fight against improvement, resist transformation that would elevate you beyond the limitations of flesh and ignorance. Why do you choose suffering when transcendence awaits?" Navigator Voss pressed her hands against her ears, trying to block out words that seemed to rewrite themselves in her memory even as she heard them. "Don't listen," she warned the bridge crew. "Every word it speaks is a trap, a hook designed to catch our souls and drag them into its web of lies." But the demon's influence was already taking hold among the crew. Through the ship's internal monitors, they could see unaffected personnel beginning to show signs of corruption. Their movements becoming more coordinated, their eyes reflecting impossible colors, their voices joining in chants that praised the changer of ways. In his containment cell, Marcus Trell smiled with satisfaction as he felt the entity's attention focus on him completely. The whispers that had tormented him for days now spoke with clear purpose, offering him a choice that would determine not just his own fate, but the destiny of everyone aboard the righteous Fury. He could resist, maintaining his humanity, while the demon slowly corrupted every soul on the ship, until it had enough psychic energy to manifest fully in real space. Or he could embrace the transformation willingly, becoming a perfect vessel that would allow the entity to claim its prize quickly and move on to greater conquests among the stars. As alarms wailed throughout the frigate and reality continued to bend around them, Marcus Trell prepared to make the most important decision of his existence. The decision came not through careful deliberation, but as a moment of crystalline clarity that cut through the chaos engulfing the righteous Fury. Marcus Trell stood in his warped containment cell, feeling the weight of every soul aboard the frigate pressing against his consciousness, and realized that he held their fate in his trembling hands. The Greater Demon's offer whispered through his mind with seductive logic. Surrender now. Become the perfect vessel, and spare his shipmates the slow agony of gradual corruption. But as Marcus looked through the impossible geometries of his cell toward the corridor, where Security Chief Korvain and Confessor Matthias maintained their vigil, he saw something that the demon's magnificent promises couldn't touch. These men, scarred by decades of service to an often uncaring Imperium, stood ready to die rather than yield to forces that offered easy answers to humanity's struggles. Their faith wasn't based on certainty of reward, but on the simple conviction that some things were worth defending regardless of cost. "No," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely audible above the psychic storm raging through the ship. Then, louder, with a strength that surprised him. "No, I will not be your gateway." The demon's response was immediate and terrible. Psychic pressure slammed into Marcus like a physical blow, driving him to his knees as alien rage flooded his mind. The entity had invested too much effort in his corruption to accept defiance now, and its fury manifested as reality-warping force that made the containment cell scream in frequencies that existed beyond human hearing. "Foolish mortal!" The demon's voice thundered through dimensions, causing bulkheads throughout the ship to crack and warp. "You think your resistance matters? I have already claimed 37 of your fellows. I will take them one by one until none remain to defy my will." Through the ship's corridors, the corrupted crew members began moving with renewed purpose, their transformed flesh flowing like liquid crystal as the demon's attention focused on completing their metamorphosis. But Marcus's defiance had bought precious time. The entity could no longer manifest directly through him, forcing it to rely on its partially converted servants to establish the psychic resonance needed for full materialization. Captain Hendrix's voice echoed through the ship's Vox system, carrying the authority of 40 years command experience. "All loyal personnel, this is your captain speaking. We face an enemy that seeks to corrupt our souls and twist our service to the Emperor into something obscene. But we are Imperial Navy, sworn to duty and bound by honor. We do not yield, we do not break, we hold the line." The words seemed to strengthen the ship's remaining unaffected crew members, their faith blazing brighter against the psychic darkness that sought to consume them. In the engine compartments, Tech Adept Varus and his servitors worked frantically to restore power to damaged systems while chanting binary hymns of protection. On the gunnery decks, weapons crews prepared macro cannons and lance batteries, despite knowing that conventional ordnance could never touch their supernatural enemy. Navigator Voss, her third eye bleeding from the strain of perceiving the demon directly, managed to activate the ship's emergency beacon, a powerful astropathic transmitter that would alert nearby Imperial forces to their plight. The signal screamed across the void, carrying desperate pleas for aid, along with warnings about the entity that stalked them through impossible angles of space. "Message transmitted," she reported, her voice weak but determined. "If there are any Imperial ships within 50 light-years, they'll know what we're facing." But help, if it came at all, would arrive far too late. The demon had grown impatient with subtle corruption and was preparing for direct assault. Through the ship's sensors, they could detect massive psychic distortions building around their vessel as the entity gathered power for a final attempt at manifestation. In his cell, Marcus felt the alien presence pressing against his mind with renewed intensity. The whispers had become a roar of promises and threats, offering transcendence through submission or promising eternal torment through resistance. But he held firm, drawing strength from the knowledge that every moment of defiance was another chance for his shipmates to find some way to fight back. "You cannot win," the demon hissed through dimensions. "Your emperor is distant, your faith is weak, your technology is primitive. What hope do mortals have against forces that shaped the galaxy before your species learned to make fire? We have something you'll never understand," Marcus replied, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "We have each other. We stand together, fall together, fight together. You're alone with your hunger and your schemes, but we're never alone." The truth of his words seemed to resonate through the ship's corridors, reaching the ears of crew members who had been teetering on the edge of despair. In the medical bay, Chief Medical Officer Nash rallied her staff to treat the psychological trauma affecting the crew. In the armory, Sergeant Major Kellick distributed blessed ammunition and consecrated weapons to anyone capable of bearing arms. Throughout the righteous fury, ordinary men and women who had never expected to face cosmic horrors drew strength from each other and prepared to make their stand against an entity that could unmake reality with thought alone. They had no weapons that could harm their enemy, no defenses that could withstand its power, no hope of survival against its might. But they had each other, and in that fellowship, the demon encountered something it had not anticipated: the stubborn refusal of human beings to surrender their souls without a fight, regardless of the odds against them. The warp storm struck the righteous fury like the fist of an angry god, its ethereal winds howling through dimensions that existed beyond physical space while tearing at the barriers between reality and nightmare. What had begun as localized psychic disturbances around the frigate suddenly exploded outward, creating a maelstrom of chaotic energy that stretched across several light years and pulled dozens of nearby vessels into its supernatural embrace. Navigator Voss screamed as her third eye was forced to perceive the storm's full magnitude, the psychic feedback burning through her nervous system like liquid fire. Through her enhanced perception, she could see the demon's true plan. It hadn't been trying to manifest through Marcus Trell alone, but using his corruption as a focal point to destabilize local warp space on a massive scale. "Emperor's blood!" she gasped, her voice barely audible above the psychic hurricane raging around them. "It's not just hunting our ship, it's creating a permanent warp rift. The entire sector is being pulled into the Imperium." The frigate bucked and twisted as reality became increasingly fluid around them, with sections of the hull existing simultaneously in normal space and the realm of chaos. Through the bridge's viewports, the crew could see other vessels caught in the storm. Imperial transports, merchant haulers, even what appeared to be an Adeptus Mechanicus explorator ship, all of them being drawn inexorably toward the eye of the supernatural maelstrom. Captain Hendrix gripped his command throne as the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated wildly, causing loose equipment to float in impossible directions. "Damage report," he commanded, though his instruments were displaying readings that violated several laws of physics. "Hull integrity at 60% and fluctuating," came the reply from multiple stations simultaneously. "We're experiencing temporal distortions in decks 7 through 12. Time is moving at different rates in different sections of the ship. Engineering reports that some compartments are aging decades in minutes, while others are frozen in temporal loops." The corrupted crew members throughout the ship were changing more rapidly now, their flesh becoming conduits for warp energy that poured through them like water through broken dams. But the storm's chaotic nature was affecting them unpredictably. Some dissolved into puddles of crystalline liquid that reformed into geometric patterns, while others became living fractals that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. In the medical bay, Chief Medical Officer Nash watched in horrified fascination as one of her patients, a ratings crewman who had shown early signs of corruption, began speaking prophecies in perfect high Gothic, while his body slowly transformed into something that resembled living stained glass. The man's words carried an authority that made the air itself shimmer, describing events that would occur centuries in the future with absolute certainty. "The Golden Throne fails in the year 41,487, the transformed crewman intoned, his voice carrying harmonics that made nearby equipment resonate. "The Emperor's light dims as his chosen successor rises from the ashes of terror. In the darkness that follows, new gods are born from the dreams of dying stars." Nash tried to silence him, knowing that prophecies delivered by chaos-touched individuals often carried seeds of their own fulfillment, but the storm's intensity made normal communication impossible. Throughout the ship, similar voices spoke fragments of potential futures, their words weaving together into a tapestry of fate that described the galaxy's destiny across millennia. The demon itself had become partially manifest within the storm, its crystalline form stretching across impossible distances while remaining somehow contained within the frigate's hull. Its voice echoed from every surface, speaking simultaneously in thousands of languages, while offering each crew member personalized temptations tailored to their deepest desires. To Captain Hendrix, it promised knowledge of enemy fleet movements that would make him the most successful naval commander in Imperial history. To Tech Adept Varus, it offered understanding of machine spirits so profound that he could create technologies that would revolutionize human civilization. To Confessor Matthias, it whispered of theological insights that would resolve every contradiction in Imperial doctrine. But the storm's chaotic nature also created opportunities for resistance. The same energies that empowered the demon also disrupted its control over the corrupted crew members, allowing fragments of their original personalities to surface. Former Sergeant Vex, his body now partially transformed into living crystal, managed to speak in his original voice for brief moments between alien proclamations. "Fight it!" he gasped during one lucid interval, his words directed at the security team that had once served under him. The storm, it's not just attacking us, it's attacking itself. The chaos energies are conflicting, creating gaps in its control. Security Chief Korvain seized on this insight, recognizing that the demon's attempt to create a massive warp rift might have introduced vulnerabilities that could be exploited. The entity was trying to maintain control over dozens of variables simultaneously: the storm itself, the corrupted crew members, the reality distortions affecting the ship, and its own partial manifestation in normal space. "All stations," he announced through channels that somehow remained clear despite the psychic interference, "begin Operation Redemption Protocol. If this thing wants chaos, let's give it more chaos than it can handle." The plan that formed in the minds of the loyal crew members was desperate beyond reason. They would amplify the warp storm's chaotic nature, pushing it beyond the demon's ability to control, in hopes that the resulting psychic backlash would either banish the entity or tear it apart in the maelstrom it had created. It was a strategy that would likely destroy them all, but as the storm continued to intensify and reality became increasingly unstable around them, they realized that destruction might be preferable to the alternative fate that awaited them in the demon's crystalline realm. The moment of choice arrived like a blade drawn across reality itself, clean and sharp and terrible in its finality. Marcus Trell stood in the center of his transformed containment cell, no longer merely human, but not yet fully claimed by the demon that whispered promises through his transformed flesh. Around him, the righteous fury groaned under forces that existed beyond the 3 dimensions of normal space, her blessed hull plates cracking as impossible geometries pressed against structures designed by minds that had never conceived of such cosmic malevolence. He could feel every soul aboard the frigate, like points of light in an ocean of darkness, some blazing with defiant faith, others flickering as corruption ate away at their humanity, a precious few burning so bright with righteous fury that they seemed to scar the warp itself. Captain Hendrix on the bridge, his weathered hands steady despite the chaos engulfing his command. Navigator Voss, her third eye bleeding but still focused on guiding them through the psychic storm. Confessor Matthias, his prayers forming barriers of consecrated light around the crew members still fighting for their souls. The demon's voice resonated through every molecule of his being, no longer offering seduction, but demanding submission. Choose now, mortal vessel. Embrace transcendence willingly, and I will make your death swift when I am finished with your form. Resist further, and I will corrupt every soul aboard this pathetic craft, transforming them into my servants for all eternity." But Marcus had already made his choice during those first moments when he decided to resist. What came now wasn't decision, but action. The terrible, necessary action of a man who had seen what lay beyond the comfortable lies that protected human sanity and chosen to stand against it regardless of personal cost. "I know what you are," Marcus said, his voice carrying across dimensions as his humanity burned like a star in the darkness of the warp. "You're not a god or a force of nature. You're a parasite, feeding on change and mutation, because you cannot create anything of your own. You offer knowledge, but all your wisdom is stolen from the civilizations you've devoured. You promise transcendence, but all you deliver is slavery to your endless hunger." The demon's fury was immediate and cosmic in scope, its rage causing reality to buckle and twist around the frigate. But Marcus continued speaking, drawing strength from the knowledge that his shipmates could hear him through the ship's internal communication system, that his words were reaching souls who needed to understand what they faced. "Every choice you offer is false," he continued, feeling his human form beginning to dissolve under the entity's wrath. "Every promise is a lie designed to make us complicit in our own destruction. You cannot take what is not freely given, so you corrupt us into giving ourselves away willingly." Around the ship, the corrupted crew members began convulsing as competing influences battled for control of their transformed flesh. The demon's direct attention was focused on Marcus, weakening its hold over its other servants and allowing fragments of their original personalities to surface. Former tech adept Varus spoke in binary cant that mixed Imperial hymns with alien mathematics, his augmetic implants sparking as they tried to process contradictory data streams. In the medical bay, the transformed ratings crewman who had been speaking prophecies suddenly looked at Chief Medical Officer Nash with eyes that were momentarily human. "Help us," he whispered in his original voice. "We're still here, trapped inside these things it made of our bodies. We can fight it from within if you give us something to fight for." Nash understood immediately. The crew members weren't lost. They were prisoners within their own corrupted flesh, watching helplessly as alien intelligences used their bodies for purposes beyond human comprehension. But if they could be reminded of their humanity, their loyalty, their connections to each other. She activated the ship's general communication system, her voice cutting through the psychic interference that had been disrupting normal transmissions. "This is Chief Medical Officer Nash to all crew members, corrupted and uncorrupted alike. I know some of you can hear me, trapped inside bodies that no longer obey your will. Remember who you are. Remember your oaths to the Emperor and to each other. Remember that you are Imperial Navy, sworn to protect humanity from the horrors that wait in the dark between stars." Her words seemed to create ripples in the warp storm surrounding the frigate, zones of relative stability where human will asserted itself against alien influence. Throughout the ship, corrupted crew members began fighting back against their transformation, their original personalities struggling to regain control from the entities that had claimed their flesh. Marcus felt the demon's attention wavering as it tried to maintain dominance over dozens of rebellious servants simultaneously. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the instant when the entity's focus was divided and its control weakened by the complexity of its own schemes. "Emperor of mankind," he prayed, speaking words he had learned as a child but never truly understood until this moment. "I offer my life freely in service to your eternal vigil. Use my sacrifice to protect these souls who have shown more courage in the face of cosmic horror than any mortal should be asked to bear." The prayer blazed through the warp like a purging flame, carrying with it the accumulated faith of every human who had ever looked up at hostile stars and chosen to stand against the darkness. The demon shrieked in frequencies that existed beyond sound as consecrated light poured through Marcus's dissolving form, burning away the corruption it had spent so much effort to cultivate. In that moment of blazing sacrifice, the crew of the Righteous Fury found themselves facing a choice that would determine not just their own fate, but the destiny of everyone the demon would encounter in its cosmic wanderings among the stars. The price of defying cosmic horror revealed itself in currencies that mortal minds were never meant to calculate. As Marcus Trell's sacrifice blazed through the warp like a cleansing star, the demon's shriek of fury tore reality apart at the quantum level, creating wounds in the fabric of existence that bled impossible colors into the corridors of the Righteous Fury. His final act of faith had disrupted the entity's control, but the backlash was devastating beyond any human conception of destruction. Captain Hendrix felt his command throne crack beneath him as psychic feedback surged through the ship's superstructure, but he maintained his position even as blood ran from his eyes and ears. Around him, bridge crew members who had served faithfully for decades began aging rapidly, their life force being consumed by energies that existed outside normal time. Navigator Voss collapsed at her station, her third eye burning like a miniature sun as it tried to process visions of futures that would never come to pass. "Damage report," Hendrix commanded through lips that tasted of copper and ozone, knowing that conventional assessments were meaningless when dealing with forces that could rewrite the laws of physics. The responses came from stations throughout the ship, each voice carrying the strain of personnel pushed beyond human endurance. Engineering reported that 17 compartments had been temporarily displaced, existing in time loops that aged their contents by centuries while seconds passed in normal space. Medical reported that 31 crew members had been transformed into crystalline statues that sang hymns in languages that hurt to hear. Security reported that the corrupted personnel were experiencing violent physical changes as competing influences battled for control of their mutated flesh. But through the chaos, a pattern emerged that gave Hendrix hope despite the apocalyptic circumstances. The demon's control was fragmenting as it struggled to maintain dominance over forces it had unleashed without fully understanding. Marcus Trell's sacrifice had created a resonance cascade in the warp storm, amplifying the chaotic energies beyond the entity's ability to direct them coherently. In the transformed containment cell that had become a nexus between dimensions, the demon's partially manifested form writhed in what might have been pain as its crystalline substance began developing cracks that leaked raw possibility into the surrounding space. Its voice, which had spoken with cosmic authority throughout the crisis, now carried harmonics of uncertainty and something that might have been fear. This outcome was not. The variables were controlled," it stammered, its words fragmenting as the very concepts it tried to express became unstable in the chaotic energies surrounding the frigate. Security Chief Korvain recognized the opportunity immediately. "All loyal personnel, concentrate fire on the containment level," he ordered, knowing that conventional weapons might prove effective against an entity struggling to maintain cohesion in unstable space. "Target the crystalline formations. Don't let it stabilize its manifestation." Lasfire and bolter rounds poured into the warped spaces around the detention level, their blessed ammunition carrying prayers that had been spoken over weapons designed to kill humanity's enemies. The shots seemed to have effects far beyond their physical impact, each hit causing ripples in reality that disrupted the demon's attempts to anchor itself in normal space. But the entity's death throes were as dangerous as its active malevolence. As its control collapsed, the corrupted crew members throughout the ship began changing unpredictably, their transformed flesh responding to psychic influences that no longer followed coherent patterns. Some dissolved into puddles of liquid crystal that tried to flow toward the nearest unprotected personnel. Others became living geometric equations that calculated probability matrices for events that existed outside causality. In the medical bay, Chief Medical Officer Nash watched as the transformed ratings crewman who had been speaking prophecies suddenly looked at her with eyes that blazed with inhuman intelligence. But instead of alien malevolence, she saw something unexpected: gratitude. "Thank you," he said in a voice that carried harmonics of crystal chimes, "for reminding us who we were. We can see now. See what it planned to do with our forms, our memories, our connections to each other. We choose differently." Throughout the ship, the remaining corrupted crew members made similar choices, their human personalities reasserting control over bodies that had been transformed beyond recognition. But the cost of their resistance was immediate and terrible. Flesh that had been reshaped by warp energies began breaking down as human will battled alien influence for dominance. Former tech adept Varus, his augmetic implants now fused with crystalline growths that pulsed with mathematical certainty, managed to reach a critical junction in the ship's power distribution network. With hands that were no longer entirely human, he began implementing changes to the frigate's systems that would channel the chaos energies building around them into a focused discharge. "Captain," he reported through communication channels that carried his words across impossible distances, "I can redirect the psychic backlash, use the ship's systems as a focusing array, but the process will overload our generators, destroy our warp drive, leave us stranded in real space for years." Hendrix didn't hesitate. Do it. Better stranded than consumed. As Varus implemented his desperate gambit, the remaining loyal crew members throughout the ship prepared for consequences they couldn't predict or prevent. They had chosen to stand against cosmic horror despite impossible odds, and now they would discover what price the universe demanded for such audacity. The demon's final scream echoed across dimensions as the chaos energies it had sought to control turned against it, but its death would not come without taking portions of their humanity with it into whatever realm awaited entities that were banished from reality itself. The death of a greater demon is not a quiet affair, but a cosmic catastrophe that rewrites the fundamental laws of reality in the space surrounding its demise. As the entity that had called itself the Architect's Chosen finally lost cohesion under the combined assault of human will and chaotic energies, its dissolution sent shockwaves through dimensions that mortals had no names for, transforming the righteous fury into something that existed partially in normal space and partially in realms where thought became substance and will reshaped matter. Captain Hendrix felt the change in his bones as the frigate's hull began incorporating elements that belonged to the crystalline realm the demon had tried to manifest. Bulkheads that had been blessed steel now showed veins of impossible crystal that sang with harmonics beyond human hearing. Corridors that had run straight for centuries now curved through angles that existed in more than 3 dimensions, creating spaces that were simultaneously larger and smaller than their original configuration. "Status report," he commanded, though his voice now carried undertones that made nearby equipment resonate in sympathy. The transformation hadn't been entirely one-sided. The crew's successful resistance had left its own mark on the supernatural forces that had tried to claim them. Navigator Voss, her third eye now permanently sealed behind scar tissue that gleamed with silver light, managed to access her instruments despite the radical changes to the ship's structure. "We're stable in real space, Captain, but we're not entirely in real space anymore. The ship exists simultaneously in our dimension and in several others. I can chart courses through normal space, but will also be traveling through realms that parallel our own reality. The implications were staggering. They had become something unprecedented in Imperial naval history, a vessel capable of existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously, carrying within its hull the accumulated experience of mortal souls who had faced cosmic horror and emerged victorious despite paying prices that few humans could survive. Throughout the ship, the surviving crew members struggled to adapt to bodies that had been fundamentally changed by their exposure to warp energies. Chief Medical Officer Nash found that her medical training now included intuitive understanding of ailments that existed in dimensions beyond normal space. Security Chief Korvain discovered that his bolt pistol could fire rounds that traveled through parallel realities to strike targets that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The crew members who had been directly corrupted by the demon faced more dramatic transformations. Former tech adept Varus had become something that existed as much as living equation as human flesh. His consciousness expanded to comprehend mathematical relationships that governed the interaction between parallel realities. But despite his transformation, his loyalty to the Emperor and his shipmates remained absolute, perhaps stronger than it had been when he possessed merely human understanding. "I can see the patterns now," he reported from engineering, his voice carrying harmonics that made the ship's machine spirits respond with unprecedented efficiency. "The daemon's attempt to merge our reality with its crystalline realm has created opportunities. We can travel faster than light without entering the warp directly, sliding between dimensions where distance has different meanings." The discovery represented a technological breakthrough that could revolutionize Imperial naval doctrine, but it came with costs that sobered even the most optimistic crew members. They were no longer entirely human, and the ship that carried them was no longer entirely of human construction. They had become something new, shaped by forces that existed beyond the comfortable certainties of Imperial doctrine. Confessor Matthias, his own faith deepened rather than shaken by direct confrontation with cosmic evil, worked to help the crew understand their transformation in theological terms. "We are not corrupted," he preached in services held in chapels that now existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. "We are tested and purified, forged in fires that would have consumed lesser souls. The Emperor has used our ordeal to create something new, his servants who can stand guard against threats that exist beyond normal reality." In the former detention level where Marcus Trell had made his final sacrifice, the crew established a shrine that somehow managed to exist in perfect Imperial architectural style despite occupying spaces that curved through impossible angles. The memorial they built honored not just Trell's heroism, but the sacrifice of every crew member who had faced transformation and chosen to maintain their humanity despite the cosmic forces that sought to remake them. As the righteous fury resumed its patrol through space that was simultaneously normal and impossible, its transformed crew began to understand the magnitude of what they had accomplished. They had faced one of Tzeentch's most powerful servants, and emerged victorious not through superior weapons or technology, but through the simple human refusal to abandon each other in the face of overwhelming darkness. Their ship now served as proof that mortals could resist cosmic horror without losing their essential humanity, that faith and fellowship could stand against forces that claimed dominion over reality itself. They had paid prices that would mark them forever, but they had also gained something invaluable: the knowledge that even in a universe where 10 billion souls screamed in agony every second, some things remained worth fighting for regardless of the cost. The Emperor protects those who protect each other, and in the dark millennium ahead, the transformed crew of the Righteous Fury would carry that truth to battles against enemies that existed beyond the nightmares of ordinary humans. Conclusion: in the aftermath of cosmic horror, when the screaming winds of the warp have finally stilled and reality has settled into new configurations that mortal minds can barely comprehend, the survivors must learn to carry burdens that no human was ever meant to bear. The crew of the Righteous Fury discovered that victory against the forces of chaos comes not with parades or commendations, but with the quiet knowledge that they had stood at the threshold between dimensions and refused to let darkness pass. Captain Hendrix filed his report to Sector Command using terminology that existed in no Imperial manual, describing encounters with entities that challenged every assumption about humanity's place in the cosmos. The response came months later, a simple acknowledgement that their frigate had been reclassified as an experimental vessel assigned to patrol regions of space where conventional Imperial doctrine proved inadequate against supernatural threats. They became legends whispered among navigator houses and Inquisition archives, the ship that had faced a greater demon in real space and survived with crew intact. But those who knew the full truth understood that survival was not the same as victory, and victory was not the same as escape from consequences that would echo through eternity. Marcus Trell's name was inscribed in the ship's memorial chapel, alongside thousands of other Imperial heroes, but his true monument existed in the transformed souls of his shipmates, men and women who had seen the face of cosmic evil and chosen humanity over transcendence. Fellowship over individual salvation, duty over personal survival. His sacrifice had taught them that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act righteously despite understanding exactly what horrors waited in the dark between stars. The Righteous Fury continued its service for decades after the incident, its hybrid nature allowing it to respond to threats that conventional vessels could never reach. Its crew, forever changed by their encounter with forces beyond human understanding, became guardians against incursions from dimensions where geometry obeyed different laws and time moved in spirals that led backward toward forgotten sins. They learned to see beauty in their transformation, finding strength in bonds forged by shared trauma and mutual sacrifice. When new crew members joined their ranks, they were initiated not through standard Imperial protocols, but through ceremonies that acknowledged the unique nature of service aboard a vessel that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. Navigator Voss, her third eye forever scarred, but her perception enhanced beyond normal human limits, charted courses through space-time configurations that revealed the hidden architecture underlying reality itself. She discovered that the demon's defeat had created permanent changes in local warp currents, establishing safe passages through regions that had been navigational hazards for millennia. But perhaps the most profound legacy of their ordeal was the knowledge they carried, the certainty that even in a universe dominated by entities of unimaginable power and malevolence, individual choices still mattered. When faced with corruption that promised easy answers to life's most difficult questions, they had chosen the harder path of remaining human, despite the costs that choice demanded. In the end, the story of the Righteous Fury became a testament to the idea that heroism was not about wielding power sufficient to reshape reality, but about maintaining faith in values that transcended personal survival when everything else had been stripped away. They had looked into the abyss of cosmic horror and discovered that sometimes, if you stare long enough with sufficient courage and conviction, the abyss blinks first. The Emperor protects those who protect each other, and in the dark millennium that stretched ahead, that truth would prove more powerful than any weapon forged by human hands or alien intelligence. For in the end, when all certainties have crumbled and all comfortable lies have been burned away by contact with forces beyond mortal comprehension, what remains is the choice to stand together against the darkness, whatever form it might take. Their victory was measured not in enemy casualties or territory reclaimed, but in souls preserved intact, despite pressures that could reshape reality itself. And in the vast, hostile universe of the 41st millennium, there was no greater triumph than the simple act of remaining human when everything else was being transformed into something alien and hungry and eternally unsatisfied. The Emperor protects. More stories await.